what energy justice is trying to tell us is that we need to redistribute resources in a way that will assist these global south countries to address their renewable energy deficiencies. So when you look at the policies for addressing climate change in different countries, when you aggregate them, they will take us nowhere near the goal that has been set by the Paris Agreement, for example, which is to keep the global temperatures within 2 degrees and, of course, within 1.5 degrees Celsius, if possible. If I identify with you, it means I can feel your pain. It means I can put myself in your shoes, okay? Then it also looks at solidarity. Solidarity simply means that I can also assist you because you merit that assistance.
Welcome to the latest episode of Ready, Steady, Green. In this podcast, we're discussing challenges and opportunities of turning climate awareness to climate action. In other words, making sustainability sustainable. We will be focusing on young people as they are the ones who are and will be most affected by the global challenges of today and tomorrow, and they are the ones whose actions can actually change the current trajectory. This is not intended to be a specialist podcast to sustainability experts. Instead, it aims to broaden the discourse and help everyone realize how closely the topics of sustainability, climate, health, energy, quality of life, equality of chances, innovation, technological development, and so on are all connected. The episodes from Ready, Steady, Green aim to inspire everyone to step up and step out in their lives and in their community. If you like what you hear, make sure to follow it on your favorite podcast platform. Share it with your friends and invite others to listen to it. You can also listen to our earlier episodes and feel free to send me a message. Who would you like me to invite as our next guest? Our guest for today is Chitzi Ogbumgbada. Chitzi is a lecturer in law at the University of Exeter with a PhD in law from the University of Strathclyde, an LLM in oil and gas law from the University of Aberdeen, and an LLB from River State University. His PhD thesis developed an African communitarian approach to demonstrate how this approach could be operationalized through international climate law and international human rights law to address renewable energy injustices. His primary research interest lies at the intersection of international energy and environmental law, and he's mainly concerned with how legal obligations interact with issues like climate change, energy security, and clean energy. So welcome to our podcast.
Thank you very much, Gabor. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for accepting our invitation. And I'm wondering, did I cover everything properly, or is there something that I missed out and is important to mention?
I mean, you basically covered everything. Just to only add to that, I regularly participate in conferences and speak on areas that align with my research interests. So that's just it.
Absolutely. If someone wants to follow you, definitely you have a very long list of high-profile publications, and also you're a regular speaker at events, which is great because it also indicates how important this topic is that you cover. So let me jump right away into one of the topics that interest me. Looking at some of the pieces that you wrote and you cover, I sense that something seems to be wrong with the legal framework, how actually energy is being governed and how it is being regulated and how all is this being ensured. So why is that so? What is fundamentally wrong with the regulation of our energy systems?
That's a fascinating question, Gabor. There are two ways to approach this question. The first is to say that the laws that we have presently are not inherently bad laws. They're not inherently bad laws. And what, would really be important is how well we use the law, wield the law to address some of these problems, whether they have to do with the energy transition or whether they have to do with, energy production more generally. So there really is no problem with the law. When we take the UK, for example, we look at some of the law, like the Climate Change Act, which was the first legislation in the world to address climate change from a legal perspective more holistically. That is a very good piece of legislation. It is not inherently bad. What is at issue is how well we are able to meet the demands of that law. So recently, the government was challenged by charity for not producing policy that can adequately address climate change. Okay, and that's obligation to produce such a policy can be traced to the Climate Change Act. So you see the Climate Change Act being very useful here, but you see the way it's been operationalized, the way it's been used being problematic. So the law is not really bad, but how it's been used to address some of these problems.
For my understanding, who is it that might not be using or adapting the law as it should be? Is it the government itself or the various authorities, or is it rather the individual actors, companies, organizations? Where does the responsibility lie?
The primary responsibility will lie with the government, policymakers, those who have the responsibility to implement the law. Okay, so I just gave the example of the government not producing policy that firmly aligns with the UK's law on climate change. So policymakers, then of course you've got regulators who have got this responsibility to equally make regulation in line with existing law that helps to address some of these challenges. Companies too have also got a role to play in terms of not keeping to the law. And for this, I will just give an example of some of the cases that we see on climate change litigation. Some of these cases are against companies for not carrying out activities, operations in a way that aligns with some of the goals on climate change that we have. So I think it's a bit more multifaceted, so where we have the government not doing enough or need to do enough, and then you've got regulators, you've got companies, then before we talk about individuals. The individuals are just at the bottom of the pecking order, but the main responsibility has to lie with the government and policy makers.
It is interesting what you're saying because it ties beautifully with actually our previous guest's thoughts. Simon King, he was talking quite a bit about the corporate perspective or companies' perspectives on climate change and adapting and following regulations. And what he highlighted was that it is a very short-sighted company approach if they only operate in a sustainable manner due to certain regulations. Because what he highlighted was that there are a range of areas where sustainability can be turned into a revenue-generating activity and a revenue-generating approach. Therefore, it is in the very interest of the company, not only legally, but also financially, to follow these regulations and be climate-friendly or embrace sustainability. Would you agree with this?
Absolutely. There are many areas. I mean, if I can even extend that thought a bit further, I think when companies not only keep to regulation, whether they have to do with climate change or environmental law, when they keep to these regulations, they can expect to have other benefits as well. So let me give you a typical example. Let's say a mining company wants to come prospect for mineral resources in a particular place, let's say in Cornwall, where these days there is talk about extracting critical minerals. Now, let's say money comes and decide that, well, the first thing they have to do is to secure the confidence of the community. How do they do that? They have to do consultation with the community, meaningful consultation, try to secure free, prior, and informed consent. If they do this, they find that it will invariably benefit the company. So the company will be doing two things. Number one, it will be mining critical minerals, which we need for the energy transition, and it would have secure community confidence, which would allow it to have its profits unhindered and unimpeded. And I use that word because in Nigeria, I come from where I lived for most of my life, we have a region called the Niger Delta. It is a region that has, considerable reserves of oil and gas resources. But for many years, the region has been neglected by companies, by the government that prospect for this oil. And that has in turn bred so many vices, including violence, kidnapping, and the rest. So if there is unrest, if there is violence, it affects company operations. Companies, if they keep to regulation, if they do what they ought to do, then it could be profitable. That action could be profitable to them as it is.
Well, that's very interesting. And in fact, what Simon also said, that in his ideal world, actually, and in the best practice, companies primarily do these best practices from their own interests and not because of external pressures or regulations as such. It's very interesting what you said about the law not having, or sometimes not having, enough power or leverage. There are other fields, however, where I hear more and more often that governments should act more decisively and more strongly. Just recently, in the cafe, I was talking to someone who was rightly complaining that the gas price to fill up the tank of his car just rose by 20 or 25% from 130 a liter to almost 160 a liter in pounds in just over 2 weeks. One might ask, why doesn't the government do something about this? Is this a realistic expectation, or this is not something which one should count upon?
I think the recent rise in gas prices can be traced, of course, to the ongoing war in the Middle East. And that is something that it's affecting the global economy and all of that. It is something that is also consistent with what we saw when we had the onset of the Russia war in Ukraine, and also during COVID-19. So whenever you have those shocks to the markets, you're likely to have a rise in energy prices. So it's little wonder that the person found it a little bit expensive to fill up their gases. Now, when it comes to what the government can do, obviously there is a range of options for the government. Now, I'm aware, for example, that from next month, the government is going to roll out a measure to ensure that prices that consumers pay for energy, falls and all of that. That is an incentive. That is one way the government can intervene to address some of these problems. It's quite interesting, however, when we look at this, and why I say it's interesting is that we are essentially in a capitalist society, and not just capitalist, but free markets, where the markets would be trusted to regulate oil and regulate prices. Market forces will be the be all and end all. So when you see the government intervening with welfarist measures or policies, it does get to say, well, maybe capitalism and free market is not all we should have. And that has always been my argument. And that is why in my research, I try to explore conceptions of justice, philosophical perspectives that go outside the free market enclave, that just tell you that, well, we need a way to arrange society that also takes welfare to account. So just to summarize what I've said, the shocks we see in the energy markets is as a result of geopolitical crisis. The government can play a role to address some of those through interventionist initiatives. But again, these shocks and the government's intervention can also reignite the conversation on how our society is structured. In other words, free market versus welfarism. So I think that's it.
It's a very interesting direction. And I would like to come back to this a little bit later in our conversation and pick it up from here. But before we do, I would like to ask you a little bit about one of the areas you specifically research and publish on, and that is around energy justice. In my interpretation, and correct me if I'm wrong or you see it differently, but in my interpretation, energy justice is primarily a philosophy and a toolkit to help the transition or the energy transition from a fossil fuel-based system to a renewables-based system, and doing this in a way where the rights and interests of the individuals and the communities are well respected, meaning that they are supported in their drive to adapt these new energy sources and so on. Now, in this respect, what do you see? Is energy justice currently a prevailing thing, or what are the areas where we are somewhat, or even more than so, where we are behind compared to where we should be?
That's a very good question. I mean, we're behind in many places, in many areas. First of all, let me just say your interpretation of energy justice is spot on, absolutely. Energy justice essentially looks at those ethical issues with respect to energy, with respect to the way energy is produced, developed, transported, consumed, and disposed of. So there are a host of ethical issues that are involved in that. Now, with respect to the energy transition, what it does in relation to energy justice is that it amplifies the significance of energy justice. So let me explain what that means. You're very correct to say what the energy transition is, which is simply that we have to move from the use of fossil fuels to the use of renewable energy. Now, that transition can produce injustices, okay? And there's a host of them, as it were. So what energy justice helps us to do is to identify those injustices and helps us to address them. Now, with respect to your question, whether energy justice, whether we are better off where we are at the moment, the truth is that there's still a whole lot to do. So much to do. And I'll just give one example. Now, part of my research has looked at the distribution of renewable energy benefits in international communities. So what I mean by that is, when you look at renewable energy, it's a versatile fuel. It can help us to address climate change. It could be a tool for climate change mitigation. So, for example, the solar panel and the wind turbines and the rest. Renewable energy can also help us with energy access. So, in many places in Africa, you have problem with accessing energy. So, decentralized renewables, like off-grid renewables, can help provide electricity and also clean cooking fuel. Renewable energy can also help with energy security, and it can create jobs as well. One of the things I uncovered in my research is that these benefits of renewable energy are mainly localized in a certain region of the world, and that region is the developed countries or high-income countries. And the reason for that is not far-fetched. It is simply because many of these countries have got the financial resources, the technological resources, and the capacity know-how to develop their renewable energy systems. But in contrast, many countries in the global south lack these resources. So what that means is that their renewable energy systems are still undeveloped. Their resources are untapped. So that's an injustice. And what energy justice is trying to tell us is that we need to redistribute resources in a way that will assist these global south countries to address renewable energy deficiencies. Let me give another example. I don't know if you can recall in COP28, a COP that was distinct in many ways. Number one, it was the first COP where we had the global stocktake, the first global stocktake, in pursuance to the Paris Agreement. So for those who may be listening, the global stocktake is supposed to be done every 5 years, and it's where every country that is party to the Paris Agreement sits together and decide whether the policies that they have are able to address climate change and whether they should ratchet up those policies. Now, do you know that in that COP, one of the questions that arose was whether we should transition away from fossil fuels. It was a heated debate or talking point. And at the end of the day, there was a sort of compromise, okay? And for the first time, the word fossil fuels made its way into the outcome of the COP. It called the COP decision. And that was that countries should transition from fossil fuels. But here's the catch. That COP did not say how that transition should be made. It did not, for example, talk about who should bear responsibility for the transition. Because before you transition, you need millions. I forget how much now that has been predicted. I mean, it runs into trillions of dollars needed for society to transition to clean energy. So that COP was silent, and that is an energy justice problem. Now, my thinking is that, well, even if it was silent, I think that COP was still a crucial first step because number one, it did mention the fact that we needed to transition. And it also mentioned the fact that, alluded to the fact that certain countries might still need some oil and gas before they fully transition. So energy justice issues, they are still ongoing. They are yet to be addressed, but I guess that's something that leaves us with, a lot of work to do.
I remember very vividly, actually, that COP you're referring to. There was a certain, let's say, ironic touch on all of this being discussed in Dubai and one of the regions which is the prime suppliers of oil and gas for the world. But what I sense is there is a growing level of dissatisfaction also in terms of how COPs are developing and evolving, where phasing out fossil fuels is always on the agenda, and it's not very easy to get rid of fossil fuels. Even phasing out is not very easy at all.
Absolutely. In fact, I'm presently working on an article on this issue, phasing out fossil fuel and how difficult it is. And my premise, or rather my main argument, is that when you look at the use of fossil fuels, you find that there are certain countries that can't do without them. So here I'm talking particularly, of the global south countries with significant deposits of oil and gas, countries that need crude oil, that need natural gas for their energy security. So you look at some African countries that have got oil and gas, having these as the mainstay of their economy. Now, if we were to transition from fossil fuels, the question we need to ask is, what do we do to them? How do we cushion the effect? Now, it's all very well to say that they need to diversify. Absolutely, they have to diversify. Many of these countries are beginning to see a growth in their non-oil exports and receipts. But diversification is not something that happens overnight. So we need to meet halfway. And there's something I'm really, really looking at. How about we perhaps come up with measures, we come up with incentives that will allow these countries to transition. But that's just one part of the conversation. The other part of the conversation has to do with developed countries that have got oil and gas that still prospect for it. So I was reading a post by a colleague on LinkedIn who is an expert on Norway. And, he was writing and saying that Norway was trying to go back to, producing more oil and gas as a response to the ongoing war in Iran. And I mean, Norway is a rich country endowed with so much oil and gas, a model country that, that shows us how we could use sovereign wealth fund and all. Now, if Norway can use its oil and gas, how much more developing countries? So it's almost like a paradox,
It is indeed. And to make it even more complex, I think we need to look at countries and their relations not only on a global level, but domestically at each of these countries. So I think one can argue there are significant energy justice issues even within a country, let's say the UK, where we're both living and working, simply because of the significant social differences and availability and affordability of various energy sources. Let's face it, in certain parts of the country, there is no choice available for anyone. There is one single supplier, one single possibility of getting access to energy, however much one would like to have renewable energy as their main source. it simply might not work for them. Or in other parts where you're heating with wood, for example, or at home, maybe even with coal. Again, it's an issue of affordability, whether one has a choice. So energy justice can be interpreted also on a country level, not only on an international level, I believe.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. It applies country level, international level, down even right to the local level and regional level. Yes, absolutely.
If we take this as an axiom, then what choices or what possibilities does an individual have? If I'm a consumer, an energy consumer, and of course I am because I heat at home, I commute, I cook my food and so on. So what choices do I have as a responsible consumer?
As a responsible consumer, you want to be interested, for example, in the source of fuel, that comes to your home, right? So you want to look at whether the fuel is renewable or perhaps is gas. And if you're responsible, you want to go for renewable energy. But then that's the responsible consumer. But the realistic consumer has to look for the fuel that will be cheap. At the end of the day, what really matters is are you paying for affordable energy rather than maybe looking at the energy source. So yeah, that's what you should look out for as a responsible consumer. Yes.
One of the previous guests coined it, saying that the best solution is where there is something good for both the planet and the wallet. Because in itself, just because of environmental consciousness, it's very difficult to make choices if you cannot afford those choices. However, if you can reach for a double benefit where it is good for you yourself as an individual, as a consumer, and at the same time helping saving the planet, then that's a very good solution. And I think in the field of energy, we do have, or in many cases, we do have options. For example, the way how we commute, what type of transport we use, the issue of flying, the issue of walking, there are all kinds of things. And interestingly, when you mentioned COVID-19, I just realized how much we spoke about the importance of walking at the time because of the various benefits it brought, and people realize those benefits. But I'm a bit concerned that these days, again, when COVID is already history and it's 5 years ago, we tend to forget, and walking is much lower on our list of priorities, isn't it?
Absolutely. In fact, I gave a rather restrictive answer to that question you asked. And what you've just said is a more expansive approach. Making choices as to how we use energy. You mentioned walking. Another could also be, using means of transportation that is less energy intensive. So my preference has always been train travel as opposed to flying, especially when it has to do with travel within the UK or maybe travel within Europe, unless it's a very long journey, then you have to fly. But then again, too, and it's interesting what you talked about, using an option that saves the planet and is also gentle on the wallet. Train travel is not cheap in the UK.
No,
which is
definitely not. It's a very difficult decision to make. And if you are traveling to Europe, again, it's a very difficult decision to make in terms of time and especially money as well.
Absolutely.
Okay, now I would like to lighten up our conversation a little bit from these intensive, heavy topics with a little game here. You may know that this is our 9th episode in our series of Ready, Steady, Green. And in this game, I would like to invite you to talk about a couple of words that start with the 9th letter of the alphabet, which is letter I. So I'm curious to hear from you in maximum 1 minute each. What associations do these words bring to you in relation to sustainability? What comes to your mind in terms of concerns, comments, insights when I mention IPCC?
Climate Change Organization and Science.
Are they doing a good job?
Yes, so far. Good job. Expert knowledge. A bit long, but thank God for the summaries, the executive summaries and all of that. We could always look at those. So yes, the IPCC, yeah.
To what extent do you think actually the IPCC is responsible or could do differently when one hears criticisms about the COPs and how they are evolving?
To be honest, IPCC cannot do more than it's doing, which is simply to provide experts knowledge and evidence on climate change. And as a matter of fact, the IPCC, I know they usually get invited, especially by the COP, to produce reports on climate change. I don't think they can do anything more differently other than, of course, arming the COP with evidence on how climate change is ruining society, and of course, on the different options that countries can have in addressing climate change. A scientific organization, they are impartial. We can see their usefulness in that way, but I'm afraid that is just the most we can see, from them.
Okay, thank you. Now, what is your view about industrialization as a main factor in climate change or climate emergency, but also in the terms of development?
We definitely need industrialization. We can't do without it. It's also intertwined with innovation. But I think I would want to see industrialization that is built essentially on clean energy. When industrialization first started with the use of steam engine in the 18th century, or maybe before then, a little before then, we did see, the rise of coal or fossil fuels. But any industrialization that is going to happen in this century should essentially be built on clean energy. Now, there is always that, problem between industrialization and conservation. I don't think there should be any conflict between both. What I mean by that is that we should carry out industrialization in a way that protects the environment. And a simple way to do that is to, of course, use clean energy, adopt energy-saving measures, as it were. So that is my idea of industrialization in this age.
Thank you. And I have one more term, and this is something which often comes up in discussions related to fighting climate change, and that is inaction. Is this a valid observation that often our inaction costs us a lot in terms of the quality of our planet and therefore the quality of our living?
I'll take a different approach to that first by saying that actually it is our action that has cost us the problem of climate change. Because if we did not use up fossil fuels, if we did not carry out harmful practices in the past, we wouldn't have had climate change in the present. So our action has brought us to where we are now, but that's just one piece of the puzzle. The other piece is inaction. The inaction that we should be talking about is that we've been unable to address the problem as we see it. So when you look at the policies for addressing climate change in different countries, when you aggregate them, they will take us nowhere near the goal that has been set by the Paris Agreement, for example, which is to keep the global temperatures within 2 degrees and, of course, within 1.5 degrees Celsius, if possible. Now, when you aggregate all the policies, climate change policies around the world, it will far exceed that temperature. So that is inaction. We're simply not doing enough as it is. So I think we need to do more. That is why we had the global Stocktake, which tried to come, which was a gathering, which happened during the Dubai COP, where countries had to come together and discuss how to ratchet up their ambition. So inaction has meant that we are unable to have policies to adequately address climate change, either at source or perhaps to adapt to climate change or even loss and damage.
Thank you. Interesting point you raise here. I would like to come back now to an earlier thought of yours and continue from there, talking about the global aspects of energy justice. And I did see reference in your work to an African communitarian approach to energy justice. And I was wondering what the essence of this approach is, and is there a special African model to energy justice as such?
Absolutely. So the essence of African communitarianism, or an African communitarian approach to energy justice, is to simply give an interpretation of energy justice which can help us to address pressing, energy problems. So what is that African communitarian approach? First things first, I won't take credit for the interpretation of African communitarianism that I used in my research. Credit to that belongs to the African scholars and philosophers that have theorized on that particular philosophy. So here we're talking about Professor Thaddeus Metz. I have to mention his name. And we're also talking about the late Professor Kwame Jeche from Ghana. Now, these philosophers came up with a moderate form of African communitarianism. And that moderate form of African communitarianism looks at relationalism. How do we relate as members of the international community? So when you look at that relationalism, we're simply saying that when it comes to locating moral status, that is, what should be prized for its own sake, the answer is how we relate with ourselves. Okay? So, how we relate to ourselves can also be expressed in identity. If I identify with you, it means I can feel your pain. It means I can put myself in your shoes. Okay? Then it also looks at solidarity. Solidarity simply means that I can also assist you because you merit that assistance, not because of what I stand to gain. Now, when I do this, I will have achieved personhood in the African society. That is a nutshell of what African communitarianism is. What I simply did was to take that idea, apply it to energy justice, and then got an African communitarian approach to address a particular problem. So the reason why it was very necessary for me to do that was the nature of the problem I was trying to solve. Now, what was that problem? I mentioned it earlier, which is the unfair distribution of renewable energy benefits in the international community. That's one of the problems in the energy transition. And that problem is not the sort of problem that we need an individualist philosophy to address. When I mean individualist philosophy, I'm talking about philosophies that prize the internal characteristics of a human. So those internal characteristics could be either dignity or rationality and so on. Those philosophies are important, but they can't really help us to come up with a perspective that can help us to address the problem of unfair distribution of renewable energies, energy benefits. So that's where African communitarianism comes in. So an African communitarian approach to global energy justice looks at things like distributing resources from developed countries to developing countries, and those resources can be used to address renewable energy failure, the failure of renewable energy benefits. Okay. He also looks at transfer of financial, technological, and of course capacity-based resources. So in a nutshell, that's what African communitarianism does for us in global with respect to energy justice.
If I understand this correctly, it might seem somewhat of an uphill battle for me. What you have on the other side, or well, not necessarily the other side, but what is also in the picture are the big companies that are producing non-renewable energies, primarily oil and gas, and to some extent, of course, coal, which is still a player. And then, the question mark issue of nuclear energy, which is neither here nor there. But nevertheless, with carbon-based fossil fuels, there is incredible power behind those producers of energy. So in a way, you have the concept, what you described here, which is definitely a much fairer, egalitarian, I would say, humanistic or human-focused approach to having the right to accessible and affordable energy from a source which is also good for the planet. But on the other hand, on the supply side, with an economist's term, you have vast amounts of oil and gas which are looking for market, and the grounds are not even for this game, are they?
Totally agree. And again, too, when you want to add to the complexity, you find that many of these companies obviously are deriving profits. But this is the thing about energy justice. It is multifaceted in the sense that it also engages this aspect, which is this particular point of view that you've just presented. To be honest, with respect to African communitarianism, it recognizes that, okay, well, these companies can, of course, engage in, the extraction of fossil fuels and all of that. But again, too, the outcome should be fair. Okay. Now, what does that mean? Let's look at the issue more introspectively. These companies extract oil and gas. Now, to whose benefits would that be? It will be, of course, the company's benefits, because if they extract oil and gas, they sell the oil and gas and then they get profits. But again, we shouldn't forget the fact that they also pay royalties to the state. They pay tax to the state. Now, that tax, that royalty goes into government revenue. So the government is also now involved in it. Now, energy justice recognizes all of this fact as a concept. It can be used, it does recognize this fact. And it tells us that if a country, for example, is reliant on oil and gas receipts, you shouldn't just take that away from them. Oil and gas it's a national security fuel. So it means that if companies are extracting oil and gas, the benefits, the profits do not just go to them. The state is also involved. Now, if the state is involved, we are all involved as well. So energy justice looks at how that outcome, the production, the extraction, the consumption can be fair.
I see. Now, I would like to appeal to you now as an educator working with young people, with university students. And what comes to my mind is that the concept you are elaborating here, it's quite complex. It has, you call it multifaceted. It's interdisciplinary. You need to understand law. You need to understand energy. You need to understand green economics or economics in general. You need to have an understanding of the human mind and thinking, some of the social sciences aspects. So I'm wondering, to what extent do you find young people interested and open to the concept of energy justice? To what extent are they on board in thinking together with you, learning from you, and perhaps contributing even further to this thinking?
With respect to that, well, we need more empirical study, to be honest. We need to do more research to gauge the interest of young persons in energy justice. I can speak, however, on the interest of young persons in sustainability and energy issues, which also engage energy justice. And I can say that, this is an area that young persons have been really, really involved in. Some of them carry out advocacy programs, which is something that is needed. Advocacy programs like trying to enlighten people on climate change. I've got friends, I've got colleagues, I've also got, students too that are really, really keen on this area or areas. And one of the ways too that I've also helped, apart from teaching about energy justice and researching about it, I've also organized gatherings where we looked at how energy justice can, be mainstreamed in, of course, the law curricula. Just last year, I had one of such workshops, which was funded by the Society of Legal Scholars. We tried to show how energy justice can be incorporated into the law school curriculum. All of this is just to get young persons to be interested in, young persons are broadly interested in sustainability, in energy issues. That is my experience anyway.
And I think one can add to this a thought which was raised by an earlier guest, again, Franziska Weder, who's a professor of sustainability in Vienna, Austria. And she said often she feels that she has to step on the toes of some of her students, meaning in a way to provoke them, to get them to think beyond, outside of the box, to get them into action and combine thoughts and knowledge, competences from various areas to develop something new, simply because these problems are very complex. They have not been solved. They all relate to sustainability, which clearly is an area of interest for many young people. However, to develop solutions and to develop a thorough understanding of this all, one needs to step out of our comfort zone and go beyond what we usually do. I'm wondering, in the classroom, have you come across practices or examples that you find especially useful in making sustainability understandable and approachable to our students?
With my involvement, my passionate involvement in the delivery of environmental law and sustainability modules, I've seen the way colleagues have tried to incorporate sustainable development. So one of them, for example, one practice is inviting guest speakers to come speak with students. So I think that was last year, we had someone from the Environmental Protection Agency, come address students on the environmental law module. And I think that's a practice, that, helps to bridge theory with practice. Okay. Others, of course, could be designing assessments in a way that gives students that practical experience of what sustainability means outside the classroom. One practice that I've got, because I also, as you very well know, have an involvement in the delivery of an environmental law module at Roehampton. One of the things that I've really, really liked is the presence of debates, in class. So encouraging young persons to debate these issues. And apart from debating, you find that when you encourage them to tell you their perspective, you also learn from them. So, one of the presentations that I had a chat with the students, and they were telling me about their presentation on Brazil, how the fires in the Amazon had a political undertone. And I absolutely had no idea that was it. So that's a way to bring sustainability to the fore as it is.
On this notion where you mentioned the debate in the classroom, I think in our case at the University of Roehampton, it is even more so with this module, Earth in Crisis, because students come from different schools and therefore that represent different perspectives. They have often varied or sometimes even contradicting approaches to sustainability. And it is, I can confirm, it is very interesting listening to them confront their ideas and perceptions and then trying to come to an agreement. Yes, that is absolutely the case. Now, one last question on my side, and that is coming back to the original topic and research. What are the areas perhaps you are looking at in prospective further field of study for yourself, where you believe that with your background, the areas that you have covered and all the knowledge that you have in the field, you could bring it further to other areas of interest?
Absolutely. I do have areas in mind that I would like to, investigate further, not just as an appendage of energy justice or even sustainability, although it is very likely that I might incorporate some energy justice ideas into these other areas. Now, what are these other areas? There are two of them that I've always got in mind. The first is on comparative law. And so my LLM dissertation was on legal transplants with respect to offshore health and safety in the UK and Nigeria. Particularly liked the legal transplant bit. That was my theoretical framework, okay, and that falls under comparative law. So one of the things I'm looking to explore further is how to use what I already know about comparative law and exploring it further. And then maybe incorporating some ideas of energy justice. These are early days. I haven't really got that all figured out. A little bit of time on my hands, it's an area that I'm willing to pursue in order not to create this sort of silo that, you don't tunnel vision that can come as a result of focusing heavily on energy justice. The second area is law and literature. Having been someone who likes literature, and currently I do have, by the way, a Substack where I do post some of my travel writing and all of that. I love literatures. I'm really keen on pursuing the connection between law and literature. How is law connected to literature? Are there learning points between both? Can law learn from literature, and can literature learn from law? And it's actually a fascinating area. When you look, for example, at the judgments of courts, you find that it's got a particular arrangement, the particular style of arranging, the particular way a judge delivers a judgment. Or maybe you look at statutes. Statutes have got a way that they are arranged. Is that arrangement, does it just fulfill an aesthetic purpose, or perhaps is it instrumental? So these are sort of questions that I intend to pursue. If energy justice features in any of these, well, it's just a bonus, but these areas are clearly independent from energy justice.
Well, I'm curious to hear how it goes. I'm sure if you get to it, you will, similarly to how you have made your step into energy justice or the topic of energy justice, you will go places in this area of law and literature. I'm really curious to read about it myself. Thank you very much. This brings an end to our discussion. Thank you very much, Chitzi, for coming along and sharing your thoughts with our listeners. Thank you for listening to our podcast today. If you liked it, make sure to follow it on your favorite podcast platform and share it with your friends. Also, feel free to invite others as well as suggest whom to invite next. Help us get the message through. We all need to act on sustainability now. This was Gabor Sarlos with Ready, Steady, Green. Bye for now.